perfect. And then in the space of one day, it is nothing. To me, that requires an explanation.
This is none other than the principle of sufficient reason, or PSR, the principle that every fact has an explanation, that for anything that exists, there is a sufficient reason for its existence. In this video, I give an argument for the PSR that deniers of PSR have an internally incoherent worldview, and as we'll see, such dissenters deny PSR only when it is convenient for them, only when it suits them. To begin, however, let's forget the PSR for the time being. Let's not focus on PSR, which, if true, is a universal, metaphysically necessary principle, and instead, let's focus on some interesting and rather harmless arguments from which we'll move forward. Consider this simple example from Leibniz. He says that Archimedes takes it for granted that if there is a balance in which everything is alike on both sides, and if equal weights are hung on the two ends of that balance, the whole will remain at rest. That is because no reason can be given why one side should weigh down rather than the other. This certainly seems like a sensible inference. Absent any relevant difference between the sides of the balance, one naturally concludes that the whole will be at rest. Leibniz here rejects a certain possibility, namely, that the balance is not at rest, because this possibility would be inexplicable. Given the equal weights and the lack of any other relevant difference, there could be no reason for the whole not to be at rest, and so the whole is at rest. I'm not necessarily endorsing this inference, but merely pointing out that it is extremely plausible. This is an example of an explicability argument. In such an argument, a certain state of affairs is said not to obtain simply because its obtaining would be inexplicable, a so-called brute fact. Here the state of affairs rejected because of its inexplicability is the motion of the balance. The Archimedean scenario illustrates the power that explicability arguments can have. It remains to be seen whether such arguments have force more generally. If explicability arguments are legitimate generally, then it follows directly that the PSR is true, for the PSR is simply the rejection of inexplicability in general. But it seems one can accept the Archimedean scenario without thereby being committed to the PSR. Perhaps explicability arguments work in some cases, but not in others. Well, let's see. Let's take another extremely plausible example, brute dispositions. Imagine two objects that are in the same world and that are categorically exactly alike. They each have qualitatively the same molecular structure and have all the same categorical physical features. If one of these objects has the disposition to dissolve in water, could the other one fail to have that disposition? It would seem not. Given their exact categorical similarity, nothing could ground this dispositional difference between the two objects, and so we reject the scenario in which there is such a difference. Once again, this is an enormously intuitively plausible conclusion. Here we reject brute dispositional differences, differences that would be inexplicable. This is another explicability argument. The state of affairs rejected because of its inexplicability is the one in which the objects have different dispositional properties. Again, this explicability argument does not by itself force us to embrace the PSR, the denial of inexplicability in general. But this case and the previous one can give us pause, for now we wonder just how extensive this embrace of explicability is. There's no cause for alarm just yet, merely a question that we are naturally led to pursue. Once our eyes are open to this phenomena, we can see explicability arguments popping up everywhere. A great example of an explicability argument is at work in philosopher Derek Parfit's famous discussion of personal identity and fission. Consider a case in which there is a person A whose brain is cut in half. Each half is placed in a different and new body. Each of the two people thus produced is, let's say, equally and significantly psychologically continuous with the original person A. In light of such continuity, which of the latter persons, B and C, is identical to A? Parfit thinks, plausibly, that B has as much claim to being A as C does. Parfit then briefly considers the view that one of B and C, and not the other, is identical to original person A. But Parfit rejects this view, for, he says, what could make it the case that B and not C is identical to A? It would seem wholly arbitrary that B and not C is identical to A. Nothing could explain why B is identical to A and C is not. It is, at least in part, for this reason that Parfit rejects this view and says that either both of B and C are identical to A, or neither is. and Parfit is thus well on his way to his highly unusual conclusion that identity is not what matters in survival. Let's pause, though, to look at the crucial step. Parfit rejects the view that person B is person A precisely because such an identity would be inexplicable. This move seems perfectly natural, and is another instance of an explicability argument. Notice once again, though, that this use of an explicability argument does not by itself commit one to the full-blown PSR, to the denial of brute facts in general. All that is being rejected here, and with great plausibility, is a particular brute fact concerning identity. We can also see an endorsement of induction as implicitly an appeal to an explicability argument. In endorsing induction, we presuppose that the future will be like the past, or that cases that we have observed are similar to ones we haven't. If the future suddenly veered from the past, if certain features previously associated suddenly came apart without there being any relevant further underlying difference in features, then this sudden lack of association would seem groundless and inexplicable. In affirming, therefore, that the future will be like the past, we are affirming that there will not be such an inexplicable turn of events. Endorsing induction, therefore, can be seen as, at bottom, an appeal to an explicability argument. Explicability arguments are everywhere. To say something of a bit more controversial case, take the philosophy of mind, for instance. The debate over the nature of consciousness in relation to the body can be seen to be predicated on an explicability argument. One dominant metaphysical view in philosophy of mind is that substance dualism is false. If there's to be any sense made of mental and physical phenomena, a popular solution is that one of the mental or the physical is to be made sense of in terms of the other. One is to be dependent and reducible to the other. For otherwise, that the mental and physical are distinct substances yet causally interact and do what they do is utterly inexplicable. Thus one of the mental or physical phenomena is explicable in terms of the other. One is to be made sense of in terms of something deeper and intelligible. Similar explicability arguments exist in philosophy concerning causation and even modality. It's argued by some that causation and modality must be made sense of in terms of something deeper, in terms of something non-causal and non-modal. Causation should reduce to conceptual containment of its effects, and modal notions should reduce to non-modal concrete entities, it's argued. Otherwise, causation and modality are inexplicable. But again, all this is not to commit one to the full-blown PSR. All we've looked at thus far are just individual inexplicability arguments. However, it seems there's a problem. Concerning some of those last few examples, a lot of people do not accept such explicability arguments, say, over the nature of causation or modality. But given the other cases in which one does accept explicability arguments, for example, the Archimedean scale case, the case concerning dispositions, the Parfit fission case, or the mind-body problem, or induction, take your pick, why does one reject explicability arguments in the case of causation or modality or consciousness, an argument that is structurally the same as the explicability arguments in the other cases? Is there a legitimate reason for not accepting this explicability argument concerning consciousness or causation or modality, while one accepts others? Our practices of accepting explicability arguments in some cases puts pressure on us to accept this explicability argument or to find a principled reason for rejecting it. Without providing such a principled difference between such cases and the others, I think one should feel bad about rejecting some explicability arguments while accepting some others. To insist on such a principled difference is obviously not to presuppose the full-blown PSR, rather it is simply yet another plausible and local appeal to explicability. The apparent illegitimacy of the explicability argument concerning causation and modality, despite the legitimacy of other explicability arguments, would seem to be inexplicable itself and problematically so. However, there is one further explicability argument that I want to consider, an argument that, unlike the others, does directly entail and amount to an argument for the PSR. This argument, unlike the previous ones, can't be legitimately, that is, non-question beggingly, dismissed by appealing to an arbitrary, inexplicable line between legitimate and illegitimate explicability arguments. Let's turn then to the final case, that of existence. Just as we may or may not demand an account of what consciousness is, what causation is, what modality is, just as we may, less contentiously, demand an account of the identity of A and B in the Parfit case, an account of the motion of the balance in the Archimedean case, an account of what it is in virtue of which things have the dispositions they do, so too it can come to seem natural to demand an account of existence, of what it is for a thing to exist. What is it in virtue of which things that exist enjoy existence? What explains why the things that exist, exist? Just as when we have a case of causation, we might ask what explains why this case is a case of causation. What is it in virtue of which there is a causal relation here? So too, it seems natural to ask, what explains why this case is a case of existence? What is it in virtue of which this thing exists? In the same way, just as mental and physical phenomena must be explicable, so too perhaps the existence of a given thing must be explicable. We must have an account of what it is in virtue of which that thing exists, just as we must have an account of what it is in virtue of which Archimedes' scale remains at rest. If we take this path, then we advance an explicability argument. The existence of each thing that exists must be explicable, just as the two objects with the same disposition must be explicable, and so on for the other cases. The point so far is just that the more or less uncontroversial use of explicability arguments in these other cases can make it seem natural to advance an explicability argument in the case of existence. The use of explicability arguments in these other cases put pressure on us to accept an explicability argument in the case of existence. Unless, of course, one can draw a line between this explicability argument and others. As in the case of the mind-body problem, to insist on such a principal difference is not to presuppose the full-blown PSR. Rather, it is simply yet another plausible and local appeal to explicability. The need to draw a line is urgent, however, because the explicability argument in the case of existence differs from the previous ones in one crucial respect. While the other explicability arguments do not by themselves commit one to the full-blown PSR, the explicability argument concerning existence does. For to insist that there be an explanation for the existence of each existing thing is simply to insist on the PSR itself. So the explicability argument concerning existence, unlike the other explicability arguments, is an argument for the PSR itself, and it is our willingness to accept explicability arguments in other similar cases that puts pressure on us to accept the explicability argument in the case of existence. It puts pressure on us to accept the PSR itself. In light of this sorry situation, what's a denier of PSR to do? When faced with this series of inexplicability arguments, the last of which is an argument for the PSR, one has three options. 1. One can say that some of the explicability arguments are legitimate, and some, in particular the explicability argument concerning existence, are not. 2. One can say that none of the explicability arguments is legitimate. Or 3. One can say that all of the explicability arguments, including the explicability argument concerning existence, are legitimate. Now 3 is clearly not an option for the PSR denier, because 3 commits one to the explicability argument concerning existence, and thus commits one to the PSR. 2 is an option for the PSR denier, but not a very attractive one at all. To reject all explicability arguments is, among many other things, to reject Parfit's argument that, in the fission case, A is not identical to B. It is to reject the Archimedean argument that the balance cannot move. It is to accept the possibility of brute dispositions. It is to reject the legitimacy of inductive inferences generally, and so forth. Taking this route is very problematic, as some explicability arguments seem overwhelmingly and obviously right. The denier would, moreover, be apparently committed to the view that rejection or acceptance of a position is never warranted when done for the sake of intelligibility, thus opening the door to no seeming end of warranted unintelligible positions. According to one, there is a line between acceptable and unacceptable explicability arguments, a line that leaves the explicability argument concerning existence on the unacceptable side. How might the PSR denier draw this line? First, it is crucial to see that the PSR denier must draw the line in a principled, non-arbitrary way. This is because the argument the PSR denier is attempting to rebut is the explicability argument concerning existence, that is, an argument for the PSR itself. In this dialectical context in which the truth or falsity of the PSR is the very point at issue, the PSR denier is not entitled to reply on the claim that it is legitimate for her to draw an arbitrary, unprincipled line between the explicability argument concerning existence and at least some other explicability arguments. To appeal to an arbitrary line is to appeal to a brute fact, the alleged fact that there is no explanation as to why the line between legitimate and illegitimate explicability arguments is to be drawn here. It just is drawn here. In appealing to a brute fact, the PSR denier may seem to be remaining true to her position, which of course tolerates brute facts. However, to appeal to a brute fact in this dialectical context is simply to presuppose that the PSR is false. And this is the one thing that a PSR denier may not do here. Thus we can see that while the explicability argument concerning modality can, perhaps, coherently be avoided by drawing an arbitrary line between explicability arguments, the explicability argument concerning existence, precisely because it is an argument for the PSR itself, cannot be avoided in this way. So if the PSR denier is to draw the kind of line she needs to draw between acceptable and unacceptable explicability arguments, she must do so in a principled way. That is, she must give us a reason for thinking that other, at least some other, explicability arguments are legitimate, but that the explicability argument concerning existence is not. Unless the PSR denier can draw this principled line, she will have no way of legitimately responding to the explicability argument concerning existence, and thus no way of legitimately responding to the argument for PSR. Question begging against the PSR for one's position is no bullet that one can willingly fight either. For to beg the question is simply to have no response at all, to have no way of defending oneself against one's opponent. The PSR denier who accepts some explicability arguments has no non-question begging way to avoid the PSR advocate's position. That is, no non-question begging way to avoid PSR. By contrast, the person who accepts PSR is not under any pressure, as far as I can see, to accept the PSR denier's position at all. In this way, the person who accepts PSR has a position that is internally coherent in a way that the position of the PSR denier who accepts some explicability arguments is not. And an internally incoherent position is worse off than an internally coherent one. So we have a powerful and unrebutted reason to accept the PSR. We may thus summarize and conclude the argument as follows. Premise 1. There are some legitimate explicability arguments, that is, some legitimate arguments which succeed in virtue of insisting on intelligibility. Premise 2. If there are some legitimate explicability arguments, then a denial of PSR results in an internally incoherent worldview, while an affirmation of PSR results in an internally coherent worldview. As PSR deniers have no non-arbitrary, non-question-begging way to draw a principled line between A. Acceptable and legitimate explicability arguments, and B. The alleged unacceptable and illegitimate explicability argument concerning existence, which entails the full-blown PSR. Thus, number 3, a denial of PSR results in an internally incoherent worldview, while an affirmation of PSR results in an internally coherent worldview. Premise 4. If a denial of PSR results in an internally incoherent worldview, while an affirmation of PSR results in an internally coherent worldview, one ought to affirm PSR. Number 5. Thus, one ought to affirm PSR.